They looked Thomas in the face and told him something almost impossible to believe. "We have seen the Lord." These were not strangers spreading a rumor. They were the men who had followed Jesus beside him. And they were telling Thomas that the Jesus he knew had been crucified was alive. But Thomas drew a line. Unless he saw the nail marks in Jesus' hands, unless he could examine the wounds for himself, he said, "I will not believe." Then one day passed, and another, until 8 days had gone by. The disciples were together again. This time, Thomas was with them. The doors were shut, and suddenly Jesus stood among them. "Peace be unto you." Then Jesus turned to Thomas, and he spoke directly to the very demand Thomas had made 8 days earlier. But to understand the weight of that moment, we must return to the evening when everything began. Jesus had been crucified. Thomas knew that. The one he had followed was dead. This was the same Thomas who had once demonstrated remarkable loyalty to Jesus. Earlier, when Jesus prepared to return to Judea, where opposition against him had become dangerous, the disciples warned him. Thomas had responded, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Whatever else we remember about Thomas, Scripture does not introduce him to us simply as a coward. He had followed Jesus. He had walked with him. He had heard his teaching, and he had been willing to go with him toward danger. But now Jesus had been crucified. Then came the first day of the week. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and discovered that the stone had been taken away. Before that day was over, everything the disciples believed about what had happened was about to be confronted by something extraordinary. That evening, the disciples were gathered together. The doors were shut. John tells us they had gathered this way for fear of the Jews. And then Jesus came. He stood in their midst. "Peace be unto you." Imagine the significance of what John records next. Jesus showed them his hands and his side. The wounds testified that the one standing before them was the same Jesus who had been crucified. And John says, "Then were the disciples glad when they saw the Lord." They had seen him. They had heard him. They had seen the wounds. Jesus was alive. But one disciple had missed it. Thomas. John makes the distinction unmistakably clear. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. Scripture does not tell us why Thomas was absent, so we should not pretend to know. What matters is what happened because he was absent. The other disciples had experienced something Thomas had not. They had stood in the presence of the risen Christ. Thomas had not. And when he returned, they brought him astonishing news. "We have seen the Lord." Consider what they were asking Thomas to believe. The man he knew had been crucified, the teacher he had followed, the one whose death appeared to have ended everything, was alive. The other disciples said they had seen him, but Thomas would not accept their testimony. He answered, "Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe." Those words have followed Thomas through history. I will not believe. Thomas established his own conditions. The testimony of the other disciples was not enough for him. He wanted to see. He wanted the evidence before his own eyes. He wanted to know that the one standing before him was truly the same Jesus who had been crucified. And then nothing happened. At least nothing that John records for us. A day passed. Thomas had not seen Jesus. Another day passed. Still, John records no appearance to Thomas. We are not told what Thomas thought during those days. We are not told what conversations took place. We are not told whether the other disciples tried again to persuade him. Scripture leaves those days largely silent, but it tells us something important. 8 days later, the disciples were together again. And this time, Thomas was with them. The doors were shut. Then Jesus came. There was no announcement from outside. No one opened the door to let him enter. John simply tells us that Jesus came and stood in their midst. And once again his first words were, "Peace be unto you." But then Jesus turned his attention to one man, Thomas. 8 days earlier, Thomas had said, "Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails." Now Jesus said to him, "Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands." Thomas had said he needed to put his hand into Jesus' side. Jesus continued, "Reach hither thy hand and thrust it into my side." Then came the words Thomas could no longer avoid. "Be not faithless, but believing." Jesus did not ignore Thomas's unbelief. He confronted it. And notice carefully what John does not tell us. He does not say that Thomas actually placed his finger into the wounds. He does not say that Thomas put his hand into Jesus' side. Jesus invited him to examine the evidence he had demanded. But the next thing John records is Thomas's answer. And what an answer it was! The man who had said, "I will not believe," now stood before the risen Christ. And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God, my Lord and my God." Thomas did not merely say, "Now I believe you are alive." His confession went far beyond that. He looked upon the risen Jesus and called him, "My Lord and my God." The disciple remembered so often, for his doubt gave one of the most extraordinary confessions recorded in the Gospel of John. The evidence Thomas had demanded stood before him. Jesus was alive. The wounds of crucifixion had not been the end. Death had not held him. And the response of Thomas was no longer, "I will not believe." It was worship. "My Lord and my God." But Jesus had something more to say. Because what happened in that room was never going to remain only about Thomas. Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed." Then Christ spoke words that reached beyond that room, beyond those disciples, beyond that generation. "Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed." Thomas had seen. The other disciples had seen. They became witnesses to the risen Christ. But generations would come who would not stand physically in that room. They would not see Jesus' wounded hands with their own eyes. They would not hear his voice in that house. They would not have Thomas's experience. And that includes us. We were not there when Jesus appeared among the disciples. We did not stand beside Thomas. We did not see what he saw. So are we simply expected to believe without testimony? John does not leave us there. Immediately after recording the encounter between Jesus and Thomas, he explains why he wrote these things. John tells us that Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples which were not written in his book. Then he says, "But these are written, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name." These things were written that you might believe. Thomas demanded to see for himself, and Jesus allowed Thomas to stand before the reality he had refused to accept. But those who came afterward would receive the testimony preserved by those who had seen him. That is why the story of Thomas matters so deeply. It does not teach us that sincere questions automatically make someone an enemy of faith. Neither does it pretend that unbelief does not matter. Jesus looked directly at Thomas and said, "Be not faithless, but believing." Christ called him out of unbelief and into faith. Perhaps that is why we should be careful about reducing this disciple to a single nickname. Doubting Thomas. Yes, Thomas doubted. Yes, Thomas said he would not believe without seeing. Scripture does not hide that. But that is not where his story in John ends. Remember the Thomas who once said, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Remember the Thomas who refused to believe the resurrection testimony of the other disciples. But also remember the Thomas who finally stood before the risen Jesus. Because the last confession John records from his lips is not, "I doubt." It is not, "Prove something else to me." It is, "My Lord and my God." What happened between those two statements? Thomas encountered the risen Christ. "Unless I see, I will not believe." 8 days later, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus looked beyond Thomas, toward people who would never physically stand in that room, toward generations who would hear the testimony of those who did, toward those who would encounter the written witness John was leaving behind. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. You have not stood where Thomas stood. You have not seen the risen Jesus with your physical eyes, but you have been given the testimony. And John tells you exactly why that testimony was written. That you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing, you might have life through his name.